Well, good afternoon. I'm Chris Scher, Member Communications Director of the Society of Broadcast Engineers and the co-host of this month's episode of the SBE WEBXtra, the SBE chapter of the web. This is a monthly meeting, usually held on the third Monday of the month. The SBE is the Association for Broadcast Multimedia Technology Professionals with more than 4,500 members, mostly in the U.S., but also around the world. The host of today's SBE WEBXtra is SBE Vice President and Social Networking Committee Chair Kevin Trueblood. Hey, Kevin, how are you?
Hey, Chris, think I'm a little bit warmer than you are there in Kansas City at the moment, but happy to be here today and excited to talk about, cybersecurity. It is a buzzword that we've used quite a bit. We've talked about it quite a lot here on this program, but for a good reason, because it's not something that's really optional in 2024. It's something that you should be doing. And if you're a novice or if you're an expert, certainly we'll have a lot of things to talk about with our guest today, Shane Tovin, who's got some common sense and practical approaches to cybersecurity, just to making sure that everything in your facility is as buttoned up as it can be and as secure as it can be. So we got a lot to dive into today, but first, Chris, you've got the member update to take care of.
That is correct. I have your SBE member update for January 15, 2024. The SBE is celebrating 60 years this year. Events and activities are being planned throughout the year, including the NAB show. Watch our usual outlets, the website, the SBE Signal, SBE News for details. Part of this is a project just announced by the Program of Certification called the Diamond Project. If you held SBE certification and let it lapse before 2023, you can apply to reobtain your SBE certification without taking the exam. There's a special application and fee structure for this. Get all the details at sbe.org/diamond project. SBE certification has career benefits, so take advantage of this offer if you qualify. On the education front, the follow-up to the four-part series Basic RF for IT called Applied RF Basics has begun. Modules 1 and 2 of this four-part series are available on demand. Modules 3 and 4 will stream January 18 and February 15 respectively. Jeff Welton of Nautel and Gary Cavell of Cavell, Mertz & Associates are the instructors. Spectrum analysis and the use of the spectrum analyzer in radio broadcasting will be presented live on January 25 at 2 p.m. Eastern. The fundamentals of spectrum analysis and troubleshooting of systems will be covered, including operation of a spectrum analyzer, of course. Greg Buchwald of Motorola is the instructor. And on February 8, we present Why Worry About Your Air Chain? The answer is because problems negatively impact audio quality. They can also affect your Nielsen PPM encodability. Presentation from Mike Pappas, Field Engineer and VP of Business Development at Orban, will discuss how to locate air chain problems and develop a course of action to resolve them. You can always access the entire library of webinars by SBE presentations on demand. For information on these and all the webinars by SBE, go to sbe.org/webinars. The SBE is planning another SBE NS workshop to be held just before the start of the 2024 NAB show in Las Vegas. It will be held in the West Hall at the Las Vegas Convention Center. The SBE is working with the NAB on presenting the workshop. Details are being set now, but save the dates, April 12 and 13. Watch the SBE website, SBE News, and the Signal for more information. On the certification side, I just mentioned the Diamond Project. The next chapter exam window is in February. The application deadline to take that exam is behind us now. So if you want to go the next round, the next chapter exam window is in June. Apply by April 26th to take them at your local chapter. We will offer a certification exam session at the 2024 NAB show on April 16. Apply by March 1st to take it there. And if you don't want to wait, or if a local chapter exam is just not convenient or not possible for some reason, private proctoring is available. More information on SBE certification is online at sbe.org/certification. And that's your SBE member update for January 15, 2024.
Well, thank you so much. Let's dive right into our topic and welcome in the world famous Shane Tovin to the WEBXtra to talk about cybersecurity today. It is great to see you, Shane, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm so glad to be here. Yeah, it's a topic that, it's not a new topic, but it's one that we as broadcasters just seem to, we still got some work to do. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it over the past, a number of years. But what I'm going to do today, it's not a master class. This is basically just common sense tips for anybody. Anybody can implement these tips, literally. without a whole lot of extra uh, time and resources and effort. So yeah,
So
let's go ahead and
so what you're saying is I shouldn't be clicking those links from payroll, the payroll department. Is that what you're saying?
well,
Because
not
I've been
unless you want
clicking those things and I'm just kidding.
unless you want nasty grams from whoever your IT department might happen to be, or if your IT department is you, you can blame yourself, I guess.
Well, and that's just it. You and I have toured a lot of facilities. We've been to a lot of facilities, and we're not going to name names by any means, but it's kind of surprising at how low of a priority that some broadcasters will put. And sometimes it's just a lack of resources. Sometimes maybe it's a lack of experience or education. But like you said, there are some simple things that you can do to basically help lock down your facility because it's not a question of if but when, and sometimes it's simple as things as firewalls, simple as things as changing passwords and not using default passwords. I know that's a big thing, or port forwarding, things like that. So Shane, I'm not the presenter here, so I'm going to turn things over to you and let you kind of go through some of the tips that you brought for the class to share about Commonsense cybersecurity this afternoon.
Right, absolutely. And Kevin, yeah, I've had the privilege to work with broadcasters who are absolutely phenomenal about this, who really get it, who really have things pretty well locked down. And I've seen a number of other broadcasters, not just small ones, but also large ones who don't quite have this down yet. So Suncast, if you want to start, go ahead and bring up my first slides here. As I mentioned, presentation day is going to be Common Sense Cybersecurity for Broadcasters. My name is Shane Tobin. I've been doing this for about 30 some odd plus years now. Started at a very, very small broadcaster and have worked for, like I said, some very large broadcasters as well. Next slide, please.
If I say anything about Token Ring, I'm going to be really upset.
I don't think we have anything about Token Ring in there, Kevin.
All right.
Um, But that is one example of security through obscurity these days. I'm not even sure anybody would know how
Oh,
to actually
that's the truth.
do anything.
Somebody will get a coax connector and won't know what to do with it.
Right, right. So one of the things to note is that these cybersecurity attacks, I mean, they're on the rise. They just continue to rise. And when I started preparing this presentation a number of months ago, some of the data that I found went back as far as 2013. And I know there's some even further than that. I mean, one of my very first experiences in this business was, in fact, dealing with a cybersecurity attack, and that goes back as far as like 1999. Some of you might remember the Chernobyl virus. That was my introduction to cybersecurity in this industry, and when I kind of really got a hard lesson in taking this very seriously. In the first half of 2022 alone, I found 47 major attacks on media organizations. That's just in the first half of 2022, a couple of years ago here.
Yeah,
There've
there
been
were some ones
billions.
that really there was some ones that were really crippling. I mean, not just to the stations themselves, but to the clients that they serve and things like that. That was, I think, that really highlighted just how big of a deal this is.
Right, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars in lost revenue, not to mention the actual costs of recovering from these events. And then on top of that, we're talking about customer data that's been breached. Now, if you're a radio station, I mean, you don't think a whole lot about customers, but maybe public radio stations, you've got donor databases that require some very close protection. I mean, and it's super super important. I mean, even in commercial radio, maybe your clients lists, your advertisers, protect their data. They're certainly part of the equation as well. Next slide, please. So one of the most recent ones here, February 2023. Some of you might remember when Skyview at ABC went down, and that was a pretty extended outage, a pretty extensive outage. Here, as of February, this article said they were in their second week as of February 7th. And Kevin, do you remember about how long they were down? Um,
It was at least a couple of weeks that they weren't able to provide their live SAT services. It was a while.
Yeah, it was a very long time, and during that, all of their services, I mean, the live services, the file-based services, everything, there were customers that basically had no content and content providers who couldn't deliver content because of this cyber attack. So talk about a lot of money lost and a lot of goodwill between clients and providers lost as well. Next slide. So here's another one, Sinclair. I don't remember exactly when that one happened. Kevin, you might, do you remember the date? Oh, here we go, 2021.
Yeah.
Sinclair Broadcast had a pretty major attack as well. Same thing, and in that case, there was some data exfiltrated from their network as well, and they had to spend a lot of time on recovering from that. Next slide, please. And then this is one that's goes back a while, but this one is really notable. This is one that I really, it's kind of a case study. And one thing I appreciate about this particular one, this was KQED back in 2017. They actually not only they reported on this whole thing, they actually wrote up an entire case study and made it available for exactly what happened during their ransomware attack. And yeah, day 33 as this article starts. So this was another one that was really, really extended uh, issue for that station, and it took them, quite a while to recover from. And then not only once they recovered, they also had to kind of do some forensics to figure out exactly what happened and kind of how to prevent it from happening again. Next slide, please. So here, the NAB actually, it's not 100% up to date. It's not. It looks like the latest one here is that KQED page from 2017. But the NAB actually has a website detailing a bunch of these incidents, and you can see the URL there: nab.org/cybersecurity/examples.asp. But you can do some quick Google searches and find case after case after case of cyber attacks, and even more specifically, cyber attacks on broadcasters and other infrastructure. Next slide, please. So, what are the consequences of these attacks? First of all, loss of consumer trust. I mean, you're providing a service. Your consumers, your listeners, your viewers, they expect that service to be there. Your advertisers, they expect their spots to run. So you lose consumer trust if you're not able to provide that. There are possibly some severe financial and legal penalties. You could be sued if data gets exfiltrated and is used to compromise somebody else, and you were found to be at fault due to that. It's possible that you may in fact be sued. There's a lot, of course, the loss of data. That's the most obvious one. If you've got, if you don't have backups, or worse yet, if you do have backups, but they're not sufficiently protected from possible cyber attack, you could lose all of your data. And let me tell you, rebuilding that is hard. When I dealt with the Chernobyl attack back in 1999, I was literally scouring hard drives with a utility. The file allocation tables have been wiped out on the hard drives. At the time, I didn't know that was what had happened, but I literally had a utility where I was scouring hard drives for fragments of files trying to rebuild. And that's how I ended up rebuilding back then. But there's some pretty severe consequences of these cyber attacks. Next slide, please. So, what types of security do we have? There are two big categories of security. The first category would be physical security. I'm talking about facility security, locks, doors, and access controls, things like card access and things like that. I'm talking about securing your hardware, locked racks and enclosures. If somebody gets physical access to your systems, then I don't want to say all bets are off, but all bets are off. If somebody really wants to get in, bad enough, and they have physical access, well, it makes it a lot easier to do that. We're talking about things like disabling unused or unneeded ports on switches and hosts. Like, for instance, do you really need that extra Ethernet port in the break room patched into a switch live and ready to go on a network that just basically hands out an IP address to anybody who cares to come along and plug a system into it? Probably not. So you definitely want to look at that. And even on systems, for instance, if there's another NIC in that system, do you actually need that NIC? The USB ports on that system actually all need to be live. Obviously, things like keyboards and mice, sometimes that's a little difficult, but servers, for instance, do you really need those USB ports on that server? live. And like I said, kind of mentioned earlier, disconnecting any unused network patches in your network. Do you really need every single port in your facility patched into a switch and ready to go? I mean, maybe you have them patched in and disabled. I mean, that's that's an administrative choice maybe. But anything you can do to make that a little bit more, a little bit more difficult, kind of harden that physical security. And then the second category of security is electronic security. We're talking about things like encryption, whether that be on the web, HTTP, HTTPS, whether that be your hard drive, things like BitLocker and other schemes for encrypting hard drives, things like passwords, specifically strong passwords, are critical. Um, Things like 2FA or two-factor authentication, something that you have and something that you know. So, for instance, a password plus some kind of token that you have, for instance. Firewalls, of course, are a critical part of actually securing electronic security and securing your network traffic, and then appropriate access control lists in switches and firewalls, so that only the things that need access to resources actually have access to those resources. Go ahead, next slide, please. Now, let's talk about how some of these exploits actually happen. We've got several different categories here of exploits. The first one is ransomware, and mainly what ransomware does is it tries to exploit money from the target after the after the attacker has encrypted your data and possibly even exfiltrated it, taken your data and stored it, maybe to extort money from you. That's the basic premise of
Yeah,
ransomware. Viruses and malware.
yeah,
Go ahead, Kevin.
that's a new one that's really that I've learned about, that's become a whole new thing. Is it's not so much to lock down and encrypt the data now. It is they will encrypt your data, and okay, well, your typical a lot of the typical recourse for that is to restore a backup, and you can get back up and running if you have a backup and you can overcome what was encrypted. But now they've got your data, and they're gonna basically say, well, we're not going to give it back unless you pay us more money. So they're getting you two
Exactly.
different ways. So they're staying
Yep.
one step ahead of our recovery efforts for sure.
It's just a digital form of extortion, is what it is. Basically, we've got your data, and if you don't pay us, we're going to release your data. Or use
Right.
it to exploit your customers and others who are contained in that, who you have information about. Viruses and malware, that's kind of the classic type that we're familiar with. Like I said, the first one that I dealt with was, in fact, a virus that got in. It spread across, you can spread across the network. I mean, at best, what it does is it reduces the performance of your network. There have been several, worms over the years that basically just got into your network and slowed it to a crawl. They didn't do anything harmful, but they just slowed the network down like crazy. At worst, as we mentioned earlier, what they can do is they can exfiltrate data or cause other damage, kind of linking back to that ransomware category. Um, the next one is remote access tools and keyloggers. So they can allow people to backdoor into systems, steal credentials and other information. So if, for instance, one of these keyloggers gets installed on somebody's system, they clicked a link in the email, downloaded something, looked like a helpful utility from a sketchy website, installs a keylogger. Well, what that can do is just sit there in the background and gather all that information, and that is a treasure trove for attackers, because now they see every keystroke that's put in, including usernames and passwords to any site that gets visited. So, I mean, that's a gold mine for them. Unpatched operating systems and software. Now, this is a big one, and this is one that is kind of a it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. I see a lot of broadcasters who still run things like Windows XP on certain systems. Don't, please. Uh, we'll get into that a little
It
bit
is
later,
really
but
that simple.
it really is. I mean, yeah, okay, we'll deal with, there are legacy systems out there, that sometimes, it's obsolete. Well, if it's that obsolete, maybe you should look at replacing it. I know that it's not a popular opinion among certain broadcasters, but there are always modern alternatives to things. I mean, do you really, really, really need that system that's still running Windows XP? We're at the
Well,
point
sure.
now where
And
most
and
modern.
The other interesting point with this too is getting beyond just the outdated OSs, but running unpatched operating systems. I know that's kind of a point of contention for a lot of folks that say, "Oh, we have these updates. We have to run updates. Whenever I do an update, it comes back up and it breaks something," which is a valid concern. But the
Well,
problem is they release those updates for a reason, and you want to make sure that you are running the new versions of Windows. For as much as you may hate Windows 10 or even Windows 11, they update these things for a reason, because it's actually in your best interest, not just because they move stuff around and now you have to do things differently, but they are fixing security patches, which is essential to the security of you and your facility.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, and there's always a way. I mean, I hate to say it, but yeah, I mean, there's the occasional patch that gets out. There was one just recently, in fact, that is, that's not quite right. But that's the exception rather than the rule. I mean, most of the time these patches go in, they're fairly innocuous, fairly uneventful, but they fixed something fairly critical in the background that you never even know about. So, all right, Suncast, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. The biggest one of all is probably the human factor. Okay. Um, and the first category in that is social engineering, the biggest category of that. It's probably one of the biggest risks to your infrastructure. I mean, beyond any of the physical or electronic things that I just talked about, social engineering is probably the biggest risk to your infrastructure. That can come in the form of emails, phone calls, or voicemail, instant messages, or SMS. uh, Even the best security can be defeated by a well-meaning user. I mean, it really is. It's all about Joe in accounting that goes and clicks on that link that looks like a PDF or looks like something useful, or something that was maybe sent by another member of the staff. Go ahead, next slide, please. So, what are some of these types of social engineering attacks? Well, there's phishing. That's probably the one we hear about most. It's the most common type of email attack, but they're getting a lot more clever. You really have to be careful now when you're looking at these. I mean, you may see some of these phishing attacks that look for all the world like legitimate emails. So it's really, really getting a lot more clever and a lot more difficult to spot some of these phishing attacks, which is all the more reason to be extremely vigilant about them. Vishing, another common one, it uses voicemail or phone attacks. What they do is they try to gain trust of somebody within the organization. And usually, what they do is they'll use previously compromised data or some kind of publicly available information, like on the website. Have you noticed a lot of websites now are kind of minimizing some of the contact information that they publish, phone numbers and stuff, names? I know that's kind of annoying, but there's a very good reason for it, and this is probably one of them. To minimize the possibility of people getting that information, using it to just do vishing. Kevin, did you have a comment?
No, this is all of this makes sense, and I know you're what you're talking about with them getting more clever in what they do, because you're getting emails from your boss, and it's not necessarily to gain access, but for the same reasons that they want you to go buy $1,000 worth of iTunes gift cards or something like that. They're using the
Right,
same methods of social engineering to get to you. So having your staff being able to identify what looks like a suspicious email, like, why would my boss email me at 7 a.m. on a Saturday to ask me if I've bought a thing for something? Like, that doesn't make sense.
right,
So having
right.
them with a healthy dose of skepticism is a good thing for your organization.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And the vishing, like I just mentioned, is becoming a really common one now as well. They'll call up and they'll say, "Hey, I'm locked out of such and such. Can you do such and such for me?" Or "I know Joe in such a, I know Joe in accounting," and da 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 da. And they'll use, again, some of these publicly available details, or maybe even, some previously compromised information, to try to gain the trust of someone on the phone and trick them into kind of elevating privilege, so to speak, and getting into these systems that way. So,
Yeah,
some
and by
cast
the
we
way,
go
I
back
do
to the.
wanna point
Oh, go
out
ahead.
for
I'm sorry.
those in the comments that are watching us on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to, if you've got comments or questions, feel free to chime in there in the, comment section. We'll try and work in your questions and comments as we go along. So I'll turn things back to you,
Yeah,
Shane.
please. This is very much an interactive session. It's not meant to be me just, being a talking head here reading my slides, because anybody can read my slide deck. I know.
Yeah, but you're doing a
That's not
great
the
job
point
at
here.
it, though.
I always hate, that's another pet peeve. I always hate it when I go into a PowerPoint presentation and they just read the slide deck to me. I'm like, I could have read your slide deck. So, smishing, SMS, it's just another form. I was actually, I just got one of those recently, claiming to be from the USPS. We've lost your package and blah, blah, blah. We need you to, we don't have your information. Like, wait, you're the US Postal Service and you don't have my postal information, but you have my text message information? Something doesn't smell right there. And of course, the link to click on to provide said information, right? Yeah, no, it seems totally normal, right? And then there's spear phishing, which is a targeted attack on a specific individual that tries to use that person or their privileges to gain access to the information systems. Um, if you're a little bit more high profile, sometimes like the CEOs of organizations or CIOs, CTOs, they'll probably they're more likely to be suspect or subject to this. But anyway, just another thing to be aware of. It kind of related to the other methods. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some best practices here. We talked earlier about passwords being one of those electronic methods for security. Well, those passwords, you do want strong passwords. And I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a string of weird characters and, have every special character in the book under the sun. I mean, it could be just as simple as using passphrases, for instance. What's the old example? Horse battery staple or something like that.
Correct.
Some
Horse
phrase.
batteries. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Use a phrase as a password. Maybe put some mixed case in there. I mean, you could throw a number or a symbol in there if you wanted to, but somewhere there was a chart. I wish I'd thrown it into this presentation about how complexity increases the possibility of brute force or reduces the possibility of brute forcing your password.
Well,
And
for
oddly
those of us
enough,
that have worked in radio, you can just remember the phrase that pays. You can
right,
just use those. Mix of 101 is going to make me rich. There's your password.
right. Well, oddly enough, and I'm going to have to go back and look at this again to see if it's see where I found this. I might just be making this up. I read somewhere that those really, really complex and crazy passwords with all the numbers and special characters required are actually less secure than using a passphrase. Am I imagining things, Kevin, or do you remember
No,
reading about that
I've
as
seen
well?
that too, and I think we all kind of referenced there was an old XKCD cartoon, and that's where you got that correct horse battery staple example from,
Right,
which basically, it was that conundrum that we made passwords too complicated for humans to remember, but easy for machines to guess. And what
Exactly.
actually was more secure was passwords that were easy for us to remember, but if they were long enough and a strong enough phrase, were almost impossible for a machine to guess, at least any time in our
right.
lifetimes anyway.
Right. And then, like I said, if you want to throw some mixed case or a special character, or a number or something in there, that makes it all the more secure. But it doesn't have to be something really crazy, like ampersand $ exclamation point at, whatever.
Yeah.
You don't have to write your password in leet speak.
Yep.
All right, back to the slide, Suncast, please. 2FA, I talked about that earlier, and like I mentioned, you want to enable that on as many sites as possible. It seems like an extra hassle, yes, but it really is something that will increase your security, because then even if somebody does have your password, they don't necessarily have the other half, the token. And as I mentioned earlier, it's something you know and something you have. The something you know would be your password. The something you have would be something like your cell phone, for instance, or a little. It used to be these key fob tokens were pretty popular, but now it might be just an app on your cell phone that brings up a token that matches with your infrastructure on the other end. There's been a pre-shared key between them, and they already know the rotation. One thing I'll mention about two-factor authentication. Using SMS is one popular mechanism for two-factor authentication, but it's been shown recently that may not be the most secure mechanism of 2FA. Reason being, somebody can actually hijack with enough information, and actually, it's shockingly a lot easier than it should be for someone to hijack your cell phone number and basically get that 2FA code without you even realizing it. There have been reported cases of that happening where somebody's basically all their accounts were taken over, even though they had 2FA enabled because it was 2FA through text messaging. So I mean, it's better than nothing, but it is it's certainly not without its own risks. You're better off with some kind of authenticator app to do that. And then finally, training, training, training. I mean, the humans are they're the last link in the chain. One site that's really popular is called knowbefore.com. Some of you might remember Kevin Mitnick, a well-known hacker. He passed away this past year. But he had a company called, or he has a company called knowbefore.com. And these guys are great. They've got a wonderful knowledge base there in terms of, a lot of this cybersecurity stuff. They also have things where they will, kind of drill your users and train your users on campaigns. Where a lot of you probably now, if you do have a cybersecurity department, they're probably sending out these kind of test phishing messages to you, where if you accidentally click on it, you get sent back to remedial cybersecurity training. I have had that happen to me once or twice where I knew a message was bogus, but my phone helpfully previewed the link for me. I'm like, oh, why'd you do that? So, but train, train, train. No matter what, how you do it, you want to have some very comprehensive method and program for training your users in place, and make sure that it's they're constantly getting this drilled into their heads. I mean, they might not like it. They might kind of shake their heads, but if they really understand the importance of this, then I think they'll be more likely to kind of pay more attention. Next slide, please.
A question for you, Shane. One
Yeah,
popped
go
up.
ahead.
The question says, upper management is pushing to look deeper into AI. Any advice on what to be careful for or watch for as we dig into it?
That's an excellent question. So one of the things to be aware of, I think, with AI is the fact that it's only as good as the information it's been trained on. Right now, we're dealing with a lot of large language model AIs, right? Which basically means they've looked at a lot of information, they've been fed some parameters, and they kind of learn from that and start producing answers based on those rules and that information. Well, one of the things we've observed is that some of those answers are wrong. So the AI is not going to always get it right. That's one of the biggest things I think I would caution in approaching AI, is that it's only as good as the data and the data it's been fed and the rule sets that it's been given. So I hope that answers the question.
If not, I'm sure he'll follow up.
No, I think that's a good answer to it, because that's basically the premise of garbage in, garbage out. It's going to produce
So one
exactly
other
what it's
thing
got to work with.
Right. So one other thing to note about AI, in terms of in terms of a lot of the publicly available services right now, is that one thing you have to be cautious of is to make sure that it's not inadvertently exfiltrating that data that you're giving it as part of your query and incorporating that into its model and its rules. I know there was a number of documented cases recently where some of that was happening, and companies were starting to see their internal code appear in these AI models in their responses. And I mean, it's a great tool. I mean, you could feed it a problem and have it write you some code. Well, I mean, you don't know if that code's going to be, great, but or you can have it help you debug some code. But next thing you know, that code may be, snippets of it may be shown to the world. So you have to really be careful from that standpoint as well.
Yep, I agree. All right, so back to
All
the
right.
slides. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about outside connectivity for a little bit here. It's getting a lot more difficult to create these islands of outside connectivity, but it's becoming necessity. I mean, a lot of times, I know the advice used to be keep your automation off the internet. Well, yeah, that's still good advice to a certain extent, but it's getting a lot more difficult to create these truly isolated islands of computing. You really, at some point, it's going to have to hit the outside world for something, right? But the internet is definitely not a very friendly place. I mean,
It's not?
there's
No way. Man,
no,
the
no, it's
comments
not all
section is
rainbows.
just brutal enough by itself.
It's not all rainbows and unicorns, unfortunately. Although there's plenty of those out there if you want to find them. Um, I mean, there's bots out there constantly scanning for things. It's not a new thing. This has been going on for years, but they've become more and more advanced in terms of how they scan, what they're looking for. Your firewall is going to be your first line of defense against most of those bots. I mean, if it can't be seen, generally it's a lot harder to hack. Um, there's a website called Shodan.io that I know my good friend Jeff Welton likes to use a lot as an example. And there's just a shocking number of codecs and transmitters out there on the public internet. Basically, Shodan is a search engine for things on the internet, right? But every time I go there, I look for I look for common broadcast infrastructure. I mean, you don't want to go in because then you start getting into. I mean, once you access it, then you become a hacker basically. Even if it's out there in the public. But just looking at the things that are out there it's scary. It is just really scary. But there's no reason for it. There is no reason for that stuff to be out there. Your transmitter does not need to be on the public internet. We'll get into that in a little while. Guys, thoughts?
I agree with you, and I think there's a lot of useful tools out there that people either don't look at, because the most obvious solution, because how those things end up on the internet is through opening ports on the firewall. It's simple. It's like if you got a codec or you got an AUI that you want to access, you open the port, boom, you're done. You have access from wherever you are, which makes total sense. The problem is that if you can access it, so can somebody else. And getting
Exactly.
into barracks boxes, getting into transmitters, you can see call letters, you can see location, and one of those hacks that you listed before was somebody that knew how to get into a barracks box, change the URL, and now you're playing something you definitely don't want broadcast over your airwaves. And
Right.
one of the tools that I've seen, and you may talk about this later, is there they've been recommended to a couple of different places, but it's called a reverse tunnel. And if you don't have the VPN hardware available to you, take a look at it. It's from Cloudflare, and it's a free service. You can use it with a domain, and it'll let you access a lot of those devices without having to open ports in your firewall. It's actually really cool, and I've got those at one of my sites. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I will get into a little bit of that later. Uh, Cloud, if you want to go back to the slides, go to my next slide here. There we go. So some of the types of attacks that we see out there, we see denial of service, and that's basically an attempt to take down your critical services through any number of means. But the most common one is just flooding it with traffic, right? And related to that would be the distributed denial of service, where it's coming from a bunch of places at once. Now that one's kind of hard. It's a little bit harder to defend against. There are ways to do that now, but if you've got a bunch of different stuff trying to hit one thing and take you down, well, I mean, it keeps the legitimate traffic from actually hitting you. If you're overwhelmed by all of this bogus traffic, a lot of times that consists of kind of this botnet of previously compromised systems, or in some cases now they have. You might have heard of what's called Internet of Things, all these little widgets and devices that plug in around, that you're connected to the internet around your home, refrigerators. Somebody was posting the other day on social media. I saw somebody post a washing machine or a dryer that was sending out like 3 gigabytes worth of data. Like, what? So I suspect it may have been compromised. But yeah, if you've got all of these other things trying to hit you, it makes it a lot harder for your legitimate traffic through. Port scanning, searching for devices that respond to queries on the public internet. And we'll get a little bit into this a little later in terms of oh, but I put it on a non-standard port. Well, yeah, that's not necessarily going to help you when it
Shodan's
comes.
gonna find it just the same.
Exactly. If it can be seen, it's a lot easier to hack. And then finally, software and firmware vulnerabilities. Sometimes there's even what's called zero-day vulnerabilities that can be used to infiltrate systems. So things that are, the hackers know about these and will exploit them before anybody else even knows that it's an issue. Those are by far probably the worst. And you really don't have a good way to defend against it other than all of these other measures that we've talked about, like firewalls and keeping your stuff secure and keeping your stuff patched. Although a patch isn't going to help you so much against a 0-day because there isn't a patch yet. But you still want to keep it firewalled and apply all those other techniques that we talked about. Next slide, please. So, what are some of these best practices with your infrastructure? Well, as we mentioned earlier, keep your systems up to date. Whether that be your OS and the patches on your operating systems, whether that be firmware on your devices. Now, a lot of times the advice with firmware is if it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, I mean, yeah, there is some merit to that, but there's also merit to checking to see if there might have been some kind of security issue that was fixed in these firmware patches that get released for your devices. And in my mind, it's always been best to try to keep your devices as current as possible for a number of reasons, security being top among them. So, antivirus software, you want to make sure that your antivirus software is up to date and functioning properly. Fault tolerant hardware. So, in other words, you want to, if something takes down or you have a failure in one of your pieces of equipment, you want something there to just pick up the slack. Um, Offline and off-site backups. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Backups don't do you any good if they're either A, not current, or B, they're current but they've been corrupted. So you need a strategy that incorporates some of these off-site and offline backups. And one good one good place to reference for a lot of these best practices is PCI. I talked about that earlier. That is the payment card industry standards. And they have some pretty stringent standards for cybersecurity. The standards are publicly available. You can go through and you can search for PCI audit or PCI standards, and you can find all of this documentation and do a very, very detailed audit of your infrastructure to see where you stand. And you might really be surprised, actually. And there are different levels as well of that. So, next slide, please.
Well, I was going to say a couple of
Okay.
points about these, Shane. That they're great points. You get asked all the time, "Oh, what's the best antivirus software to use?" And I get a lot of funny looks when I say like, "I don't." If you're using Windows 10, if you're using Windows 11, Windows Defender is actually really good. And another reason why you need to keep your machine updated, because
Agreed.
they
Absolutely.
get updated. Windows Defender is baked into that, and it'll get those same Windows updates. The other point you made about backups with offsite backups, the thing I always think about for me is, a backup's also no good if I have a fire in my control room that takes out my server and my backup. So
Well,
we as broadcasters have a nice setup, and for most of us, that we have offsite facilities aplenty. Like we, by definition, usually have a studio and a transmitter site. If you have internet at your transmitter or a means of data connectivity, then you already have an opportunity for an offsite backup. Take advantage of that.
right. Yeah, absolutely. And and of course, you also have to consider that you want multiple locate. You probably want multiple locations for these backups. I mean, for instance, Evan, I know you dealt with a situation recently where you had a transmitter site fire, and if that had been the only place where there had been backups, and something had happened, after that, well, then you would have been kind of up a creek. So,
Exactly. So yeah, that it's important to have that diversity of where you keep your backups, and most importantly that you are running those backups, because like I said, just in my mind, I think if there's a disaster that takes out my facility, well, there goes everything. So the more backups and the more locations you have them dispersed, the better off you're going to be.
right, as long as you can make sure that they stay current as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it really comes down to having that strategy, and having a good solid strategy in place. Um, so we're going to talk next about some more best practices here. Here's one that's been a big kind of pet peeve of mine for a number of years. I was in this camp for a long time, but dual homed systems. And I don't know if everybody necessarily knows what I mean by that, but that's having multiple NICs in a system that are homed to different networks, right? Well, guess what? If one of those two networks get compromised, well, you've just compromised that system. It's kind of like, Better approach would be to use routing and access control lists to control what has access to that system and how it sees the outside world. And I mean, this was pretty common actually with automation systems where you had maybe one system that was used kind of as a gateway for traffic or for remote access and things like that. Well, if that system got compromised, suddenly now your automation system are compromised as well. There are better approaches now than doing dual homed systems. Like I said, you'd be better off doing just routing to approach that, or and on top of that, using access control lists and other restrictions in the routers and the switches. Um, Definitely want to use VPN for remote access to facilities. Or Kevin, as you mentioned earlier, we've now got these other tunneling approaches that we can use as well. Um, and it's, again, it's not something that has to cost a whole lot of money. You just have to actually do it. Port forwarding, this is again, a big pet peeve of mine. Um, if it can be seen, it can be hacked, right? So even though you've changed that default port, those scanners are still out there. They're still looking. They're still going to hit that new port and figure out, oh, there's something interesting here. You're best off using a site-to-site VPN. That way, I mean, these scanners that are out there on the internet are not going to be able to hit your internal infrastructure because they're behind your firewall and there's nothing to see. Like nothing to see here. Move along. And this is a big one. Security through obscurity is almost as bad as no security at all. I mean, that's really the takeaway here. Just because you change some ports, if it's on the public internet, there's a good chance that it's going to be seen and that it could be hacked. Kevin?
Well, but nobody's going to attack my small little operation. Who would do that? They've got bigger fish to fry. It's like, no, actually, the ones
Right.
that are small and not secure are the prime targets for these kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that's I think I'll get into that a little bit earlier or a little bit later here too. That's a common one that I hear is, well, nobody cares about my little station or my little thing here. I'm just gonna poke a hole through the firewall to access it. Well, with services like Shodan and various others, I mean, it's out there, and it's only a matter of time before somebody sees it and decides that your RDS generator or your codec or your transmitter it looks interesting enough to play around with, or your EAS box. Worse yet,
Right.
we've heard the reports of that happening as well, where somebody had an EAS box, on the public internet, and suddenly they were issuing zombie alerts.
Well, yeah, and that's a lot of why we're now having the conversation with the FCC, who's basically saying, yes, most of you are compliant and you practice good security, but there's a lot of stations that don't. And we have examples of this, and this is critical to our national infrastructure and to our warning systems, and it needs to be secure. So if you're not going to take action, we're going to make you take action. And I can respect that because it is important to keep those things secured.
Absolutely, yeah, this is important stuff. I mean, doesn't matter how big or how small you are. This is important stuff, right? All right, let's go
Exactly.
back to the slide deck there, Suncast, if we could, please. Ah, one of my favorite parts. Some of the common arguments, or how many excuses can I make not to do this? Next slide, please. Well, we just talked about this, but why would anybody want to attack me? I'm just a small organization. Well, the size doesn't matter. I mean, like I said, small and large organizations are impacted by this. My station, back in 1999, little Northern Community Radio, Grand Rapids, Minnesota, they were hit, and that was back in 1999. So it doesn't really matter what size it is. Next slide, please. But I changed the default port numbers. Nobody's going to find that, right? Well, we just talked about this. No, it's wrong. Anything on the public internet, nothing on the public internet is immune from being hit by these automated port scanners. They're just constantly out there looking for interesting targets. And in fact, some bad, some hackers may in fact have rules set up that say, hey, if you find this, let me know. Or if you find something, gives it a set of rules, let me know. So it could possibly be just building a list there for a shopping list for hackers. If you find a transmitter that meets this, or a piece of broadcast equipment that meets these criteria, let me know. So no, security through obscurity, it doesn't work. Next, please. Strong passwords, they're just too hard to remember. I reuse the same one and just change a character. Yeah, you might want to think about that. It's still possible. Even if your original password was really strong, it's probably already been compromised. And brute force attacks, they're smart enough to try these variants. So if you've been using the same password for 20 years and just changing the number at the end of it, or putting an exclamation point or something, it's maybe time to rethink that.
I hear the
No,
groans already. Oh, come on.
really, really, I just can't write it on a post-it note in my desk and just keep scratching the last character and adding a number. Or no, please don't. Next,
And
please.
actually the nice thing too is there's utilities, it's even baked into like Google Chrome these days that'll generate passwords for you and save it for you, and it's even synchronized to your phone and things like that. There's also LastPass and things like that. Take advantage of those services. They're wonderful.
Right. Well, and on top of that, a lot of these services now will actually also tell you if a password or some variant of it has been compromised,
Yes, that's true.
which is a really, really, good piece of information to have. I mean, yeah, if you've got a password that you've been using for 20 years, I can almost guarantee that it's been included in one of the many data breaches that have happened over the years. So,
Y- Yep.
uh, all right, back to the slides, please. So I can't afford any of these fancy cybersecurity measures. Well, can you afford not to take them? I mean, we talked earlier about the cost, in terms of customer goodwill, in terms of possible fines and litigation, and all of that stuff. I mean, there are so many things like we just talked about passwords. That costs you literally zero to do decent, secure passwords. Um, so I don't buy the security. I don't buy the I can't afford it argument. Right? That doesn't
Well,
hold
and
water.
even more so that if you're dealing with $100 Netgear router, then that's what you've got, and more than likely it'll be fine. Keep it updated. And
Right.
that's not gonna cost you anything. It's gonna cost you a little bit of time to just run updates on it, check for new firmware, and upload it. That's really in your best interests.
Exactly, exactly. Even the most basic small office, home office routers now. I mean, even if you're just doing network address translation, so long as you don't poke holes in it,
Yes,
is better than nothing. It's better than just hanging your devices out there on static IP addresses, or poking holes through your router to those devices, right? And a lot of those
exactly.
routers even do have the capability built in for some of these VPN services and some of these remote tunnel services, so you can take advantage of that. And again, maybe if yours doesn't, maybe there's been a firmware update where it does in fact have that capability now. So it's worth looking into. And
I should
I mean,
point out
literally, yeah,
somebody did correct me on the last pass. They have had security breaches as well.
yes.
So user
LastPass
beware on
was
that one.
right. LastPass was one of those password manager services, and this is really true of any service that's in the cloud, including password manager services. I mean, yeah, they're all going to be potentially subject to that sort of thing. Whenever you put something in one of those cloud services, you're trusting in their security. I mean, and at some point you have to put you kind of have to trust that they're doing their due diligence. Whenever we put information into Google, okay, yeah, it's probably going to be used for marketing, but you have to at least trust that there's some security there, for instance.
Well, yeah, and it's
So
also not in Google's best interest to have your data compromised either, because
exactly,
that's a problem for a
exactly.
lot of people, not just Google.
Right. Exactly. Nobody wants to be in the headlines saying, "Hey, massive customer data breach." Right? That is the last thing
Right.
anybody wants to be in the headlines. All
Exactly.
right, back to slides, please. All right, next, please. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can see it, so can everybody else, right? Port forwarding, yeah, no, just there are better options. Next, please. So here's what we were talking about earlier, that the site, shodan.io. This particular one is searching for a popular, inexpensive broadcast codec. And you can see 1,445 results as of when I ran this, which would have been back in mid November. Um, I mean, having your STL available, just to the public like that, probably not a great idea. I mean, somebody can get in, somebody can change your audio programming and lock you out so that literally you have to go to the transmitter site to get yourself back on the air. Next slide, please. Here's one. I mentioned my good friend Jeff Welton earlier in Nautel. He's been really good about reaching out to customers as they, if he finds anything out there. Um, so there aren't too many of that, but there, it's an example of another piece of broadcast infrastructure and just searching for it. And there's still a few of them out there, but yeah, most of them I'm sure he's aware of and the customer's aware of. Fun stuff. So next, please. And then just searching for the generic term television. First one here looks like a web server. Oh, it's a Teradek box, which is a popular video codec. Yeah, so you can see all the information you get just by a quick little search. I mean, even if you don't publish that IP address, well, guess what? It's there. People can find it. People can see it. So hopefully they've got good passwords in place and all that fun stuff. Next, please. And again, I can't drive this point home nearly enough. Security through obscurity is just as bad as no security at all. Next, please. All right. So we've talked about the doom and gloom. What can we do? Let's talk about some of those common sense do's and don'ts. We'll give you just a quick summary here. Next, please. So use a basic firewall. We talked about this a little bit ago. Network address translation, even the $100 firewall from Office, from Staples or Best Buy or whatever, is better than nothing at all. It uses what's called NAT, or network address translation, to take that public IP address, or even if it's a DHCP address, it's probably still publicly available to ping. It takes that and translates it into a private network for you, the one-to-many external to internal addresses. Use a VPN or some other tunneling service, as we talked about earlier. That'll make sure that basically your network stays your internal. Basically, you have to actively get into your network to get to your infrastructure. It's not just kind of hanging out there on a public IP address. Change default logins and passwords. This is a big one. A lot of broadcast manufacturers now are making it such that you can't log into the device without changing the password. And I think actually that's a good thing. Yeah, it has its drawbacks. Say somebody changed the password and nobody knows how to get into it now. That person is long gone. The engineer left or whatever. Well, it's still better to change that password to something that's rather than just leave it at the factory defaults. Keep the software up to date. Now, follow your vendor's recommendations. Some vendors will actually go and test a lot of these updates. I'm thinking automation vendors in particular. They'll test Windows updates against their systems and say, hey, don't do this quite yet. We're still working on this. We know about this issue. But that's a conversation to have with your vendors to make sure that that you're on the same page as they are. But as a general rule, you want to keep stuff up to date as much as possible. And then again, train. That human factor is always going to be that weakest link, whether it be phishing or smishing or vishing or any other form of human activity leading to cybersecurity breaches. And again, that website that I talked about earlier is knowbefore.com, no B and the number 4.com. Lots of great resources there. So, next, please. Don't poke holes through your firewall. I see it way, way, way too often. I mean, yeah, there may be some edge cases where that makes some sense, but those are the rare exceptions. At this day and age, there's not a whole lot of reason to do that anymore. Kevin, can you actually think of any reason to poke holes in your firewall at this point?
Well, probably the biggest one is for those that are using like Comrex accesses and things like that, because those can be hard to lock down to a specific place. Like if you're, they're obviously meant to be very mobile. One of the practical applications I've seen for that, though, is they actually have a separate internet service. I think this is one of the best setups that I've seen. Is they had a whole rack full of Comrex accesses that had its own internet connection, completely isolated from the building, and you would have to VPN to that appliance from the building to be able to manage those devices. So yes, they're exposed to the world, but they're not exposed to your devices. They are completely isolated.
And that's a great approach. Having it isolated on its own public internet connection, and it's the only device on that. It doesn't have any link to directly to your internal infrastructure like that. That is one case where that might be, that might be an option. But even still, a lot of these manufacturers now, for again, speaking of audio codecs, have what are called traversal servers that you can use, so that your audio codec doesn't have to see the public internet. Both ends kind of talk to that traversal server, and your audio passes through there without anybody even being aware directly of the necessarily of the external IP addresses that are involved. So I don't know. I still, there may be some edge cases where port forwarding is still a necessary thing, but I don't know. I have a hard time justifying it anymore.
Yeah,
Right.
there's certainly ways to manage it, but yeah, that's the easiest one I could see is like the audio codecs, video codecs, things like that. And those are an exception, but they can be managed like everything else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was like it was like the video codec, the Teradek that I mentioned that I saw on Shodan there earlier. That might be one case where perhaps they absolutely have to be able to hit it from the outside somehow. But even then, I have a hard time believing that you couldn't have some kind of VPN router appliance. If you're using this for your own internal use and you don't have third-party external type people trying to access it, I have a hard time believing you can't have some kind of little VPN appliance sitting there that connects through your codec and tunnels that traffic for you. So. Okay, back to the slide. So again, don't run outdated operating systems and software versions, at least as much as practical. Again, there are going to be edge cases there, I understand, but you really want to avoid that as much as possible. Don't blindly answer unusual emails, text messages, or voicemails without directly verifying with the source. And again, these emails, these text messages, these campaigns, they're getting a lot more clever. So if you have any doubt, pick up the phone, call whoever claims to have sent it, and say, "Hey, did you really send this to me? This seems suspect." And they'll go, "Oh yeah, that was such and such," or "No, please don't send that guy $1,000 in gift cards." I mean, that should be a red
But the
flag right there. I
Nigerian
mean,
prince sounded like such a nice fellow.
I know, right? And all I have to do is send him $1,000 to unlock that, that $100,000 that's sitting there waiting for me, right?
Right.
Yeah, right. Don't open any attachments that you're not expecting, or again, check with the source directly. I mean, it may be that your HR department or your IT department has contracted with some external vendor for some function, and you get some unusual external email that you don't expect. But generally, they'll let you know that that's going to be coming before they just blindly do that to you. So, but if you have any doubt, just check with the source, and then don't click links in emails. Always verify with the source. You can usually hover over the links in the email. It'll show you where it's going if it looks like it's the legitimate domain that that goes to that actual site or that actual service. Even that's not necessarily a sure bet anymore, because we're seeing cases where some of these URLs are very closely formed. They look almost identical to the actual URL, but there's one character that's just not quite right. It looks the same, but it's not the same. So you always have to be really careful about clicking those links in emails. Um, so yeah, don't be that weakest link. You and your employees, you're the final line of defense in your organization's cybersecurity strategy. So ultimately, it really does all come down to the human factor, even more so than the technological factor. So, and yes,
You ran
now
out of
it's time for
slides.
any more questions. I'm out of slides.
Yeah, so Hal said Windows Sandbox is your friend, and I got to tell you, I probably haven't spent a ton of time with that, but that was a recommendation that Hal is making. So thank you for that,
Mm.
Hal.
That's great.
Um,
Yeah, and I'll also take this time to I'll also take a moment here to put in a plug for virtual machines and sandboxes.
sure.
Uh, Absolutely. If you want to play around, or if you want somewhere where you can do this stuff in a safer environment, set up a machine that's kind of a sandbox, or has some virtual machines on it that you can do this in, and make sure it is not connected to your critical infrastructure.
See, I
So,
like to set up Windows 98 in a virtual machine with the Bonsai Buddy and everything, and then wait for the Microsoft text to call me, and then
and
have
about
some
20
fun.
different taskbars on or 20 different link bars on your browser. Yeah.
I need to know what the latest stocks are, really. I know there's tons of videos on YouTube of people doing just that, and someday I'll get my opportunity to mess with a vendor like that. But in the meantime, yes, virtual machines are a great application to put a lot of those. Because worst case, you get that OS wiped out. Well, you just delete it, start over.
Right.
No harm.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Sandboxes are a great thing.
Yeah. Well, Shane, thank you so much for everything. We've got a whole lot of information here in the last hour, and we certainly appreciate everything that you've shared with us. There's a lot of, like you said, a common sense approaches to this, and they may seem pretty basic, but it's amazing what we find that out in the field and amongst maybe our viewership that maybe are looking to learn, and even for those of us that are experienced, may still not know some of the best practices because time marches on and things change and these threats keep evolving continuously.
Right. And like I said, nothing that I mentioned in this presentation has to cost a whole lot of money. It's mostly just, it's the time and effort to do it. And even that's pretty minimal, to be honest with you.
Exactly. Well, Shane, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and for sharing your expertise. It's been great talking to you.
Great as always, guys.
All right, we'll turn things over to Chris, and he'll close things out for us today.
Very good. Suncast, our producer, I'm going to ask you to throw up Shane's last slide just for his contact info, which also gets a shot of his puppy dogs, which I know everybody wanted to see. But yeah, any other questions, follow up. You can contact Shane directly at his SBE.org address there, stoven@sbe.org. So again, thanks, Kevin and Shane. This has been the SBE WEBXtra, the SBE chapter of the web. We present it monthly, and we hope you'll join us each time. Look for the replay on our YouTube channel. If you hold SBE certification, viewing the SBE WEBXtra qualifies you for 1/2 point in Category G, that's attendance. It's just like attending a local chapter meeting. And if you have an idea for a topic or a guest for the SBE WEBXtra, send it to webextra@sbe.org. And that does it for this installment. The SBE WEBXtra from the Society of Broadcast Engineers, the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals. Thanks again to our guest, Shane Toven. And on behalf of Kevin Trueblood, we'll see you next month.